Oh, you should talk louder? Okay, I will. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see you, and I'm delighted that so many could attend this exciting event in person, and welcome to everyone on Zoom as well. I have some unfortunate news that John King is ill and won't be with us today. He's expected to recover very soon. Maybe we shouldn't have planned this for Friday the 13th. I'll know that for next time. My name is Rebecca Lilienthal Schnier. I'm a fifth generation San Franciscan, and I care deeply about the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a longtime board member of the Treasure Island Museum. Before that, I served on the board of San Francisco Architectural Heritage. For those of you who are not familiar with the Treasure Island Museum, if you look out the window, look at Treasure Island, you can see the curved Art Moderne style building. That's where our gallery is housed. And if you haven't visited, I encourage you to do so. Entrance is free, and you can learn all about Treasure Island and its amazing history and past, present, and the future of what's anticipated out there. Before beginning, I would like to thank the Port of San Francisco for co-sponsoring this event and to Cal Humanities for their generous funding. I would also like to thank the staff and board members of both the Treasure Island Development Authority and the Treasure Island Museum. Do you guys want to raise your hand just so that people can? Now, I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to give you some background on why these illustrious experts are gathered here today, okay? The idea of the panel discussion began some time back in association with the current exhibit at the Treasure Island Museum called Resilience Planning. The main purpose of the exhibit is to demonstrate the enormous level of thought, time, and effort that the developers, Wilson Meany, have invested in adapting and stabilizing the island in anticipation of sea level rise. We've brought the exhibit panels virtually to you onto the monitors. They explain the variety of geotechnical methods used to mitigate the effects of sea level rise at Treasure Island. And we will replay all of this after the panel is finished, so you'll have an opportunity to see that. The effort has had strong support from the City of San Francisco through the Treasure Island Development Authority, TIDA. TIDA and the developers have been working hand in hand for almost 20 years to create a sustainable new neighborhood for San Francisco. This panel seeks to look beyond Treasure Island and place its engineering and planning within the greater context of the entire Bay Area. Clearly, Treasure Island is unique in that the developers were able to start almost from scratch, meaning there was limited infrastructure in place with which they needed to contend. Nonetheless, it was a tremendously complex, costly, and time-consuming effort. As you've seen, there are index cards on everyone's seat with pens. There will be a question and answer opportunity. So if you think of questions, please write them down, and we will collect the cards and questions and answer them as time permits. Now I'd like to introduce the participants here. John King, who isn't here today, our moderator, is San Francisco Chronicle's urban design critic, as you may know, and he has a new book out. Interestingly, it's called Portal: San Francisco's Ferry Building, which is here we are, and the Reinvention of American Cities. And copies are on sale online and at local bookstores, including Book Passage downstairs, and we actually have a copy over there if you want to take a look at it. So, Allison Brooks is the executive director of the Bay Area Regional Collaborative, BARC, a consortium of regional and regionally oriented state agencies working together to address issues facing the San Francisco Bay Area. Dana Brechwald is the assistant planning director for climate adaptation at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, BCDC, which protects and enhances San Francisco Bay and advances the Bay's responsible, productive, and equitable uses as we face a changing climate and rising sea levels. Steve Reel is the Deputy Program Manager for Engineering and Project Delivery of the Port of San Francisco's Waterfront Resilience Program. The port manages 7.5 miles of waterfront that is home to popular destinations and attractions, historic districts, small businesses, and robust maritime opportunities. Allison Chan is the political director for Save the Bay, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving San Francisco Bay and related estuary habitat areas. With these experts, today's panel is sure to be informative and thought-provoking. And Allison Brooks is going to take over at John's place, so I thank her for doing that.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca, and to the Treasure Island Museum for having us here today. And I'm happy to moderate. I think it'll be easier since there's two Allisons on the panel. I can kind of represent one of us. It doesn't happen very often. And the fact that we both spell our names with two L's, we know we give each other the nod for that. So I'll make sure I can integrate some of what I work on with BARC, but I'll take over. John prepared some really good questions for us. And I'm just going to go with the spirit of how John was imagining this conversation to go. And we'll start out by asking Dana a question. So Dana, I'm wondering if you can offer a succinct overview of the scale of what we are talking about in terms of sea level rise and flooding, the major challenges ahead, and the range of pressures that will vary depending on location around the bay. It is, and this is John, so I wish I could mimic him, but it is grimly fascinating, for instance, about how so much of the potential swallowing of land would be Mother Nature reclaiming her own, taking back marshes that were filled. So how can you give us an overview or give us, kind of what you're here to talk about and what your expertise is, and that's kind of something that John wanted to help set us up with.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. Well, first of all, the scale is global, but that's not what we're going to be talking about today. So the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, I do have some slides, so maybe if we can pull those up. I prepared some maps for you all today because everybody loves looking at maps, especially planners. Our job in when BCDC was created, we're a state agency that has jurisdiction over the bay and a 100-foot shoreline band along the bay. And we were created for a very specific reason, and that is because the bay was filling. It was starting in the gold rush with all of the sediment that was coming down through the delta due to mining. That started to fill in the bay, and then developers got wind of that and they said, wow, this is we can create land wholesale, fantastic. And they started to do so and build development along the shoreline on this fill. I'm trying to see if my slides are coming up yet, because I have maps that illustrate this.
I'm sorry.
It's okay, I'll keep going. So the maps that I have for you here on the blank screen shows what the bay used to look like in the 1800s before bay fill began, and it was much larger than it is today. When BCDC was created in 1965, we were on a trajectory that would have made the bay nothing but a glorified river by 2020. Fortunately, we stopped that, and we've preserved really the shoreline that we had in 1965. But that's changing. So we're actually facing the opposite problem that we faced when BCDC was created. Oh, I see something there. Great, fantastic. Are you all seeing that?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can see what, thank you so much. This is what I was illustrating here. The bay in 1849 was much larger. In 1965, that's what the bay looks like today. And one of the things, and this is the grim reality that John King was referring to, and I do have a slide to illustrate this, and I'm waiting because it's actually really compelling. But if you look at the sea level rise projection maps, the sea level rise that we're anticipating in the next century actually creates the old shoreline that we had in 1849. So all of those low-lying areas will be back refilled, and we'll be seeing the bay becoming larger again. I also have some maps that you can just picture in your head about some of the other impacts that we're looking at around the bay, where it's not just sea level rise, we're looking at other impacts from sea level, from climate change, including increased storm surge. And one of the new emerging threats that we've been doing a lot of research on recently is the phenomenon of rising groundwater, which will flood us from under the ground and impact all of our underground infrastructure. And more importantly, we have a lot of contaminated sites along our shoreline, and those contaminants could be mobilized by either overland flooding from sea level rise or this groundwater rise that's coming up from down below. The other thing that I'd like to mention, that my program published a report in 2020 that outlines all the ways in which the systems that we rely on in the Bay Area are interconnected. So this isn't just I don't live along the shoreline, so I'm fine. My house is inland. We have so many different interconnected systems that we all rely on, like our transportation systems. Many of our major freeways are along the Bay shoreline. Many of them are projected to be flooded. Many of them are low-lying and projected to be flooding. I live in Marin County, and if you've ever driven on 101 at high tide near Mill Valley or Sausalito, you can't drive over it in certain parts of the year. So that impacts everyone. We're also looking at a lot of the areas that we've planned for future development for both jobs and housing are also along the shoreline. And this is because a lot of our existing infrastructure is along the shoreline. We have ferry terminals, we have BART stations, we have all of the things that make desirable walkable neighborhoods, but they are projected to be flooded in the future. I cannot not talk about our habitats, our wetlands along the Bay shoreline, the habitats for migrating birds. We're a major stopover for the Pacific Flyway here in the Bay Area. And all of those wetlands along the shoreline are, there we go. That's my, okay. Okay, you can go back one. Thank you. So just if we can, I don't think, you know what, we can just skip the slides if it's stressful. Don't worry about it.
Do you want to go back another slide?
No, it's okay. I'll just keep talking because I've already actually gotten through half of my talking points anyway. So just as I was talking about transportation networks, this is some of the mapping that we did that showed all of the transportation networks in the Bay Area. This is roads and highways, major highways. And you can just see how, we've overlaid sea level rise future scenarios here, and you can just see how much of that infrastructure is at risk in the future. I was also talking about wetlands and habitats. Many of those are along the shoreline, and wetlands can migrate inland over time, but only if they have the space to go. So we risk really drowning out our wetlands and losing all of that habitat. This slide here is looking at the fact that we have a lot of our socioeconomically vulnerable communities along the shoreline, and they will be disproportionately impacted by sea level rise compared to our non-socially vulnerable block groups. So these are the areas that need extra resources to prepare for sea level rise, and we need to make sure that they're not displaced from the region. If you can go forward, that would be great. There we go. I was talking about, yay, thank you. I was talking about our future development areas. We worked with MTC ABAG that produces a framework called priority development areas. And these are areas around the Bay that have been identified by local jurisdictions as being really prime for new development. Because as I said, they have transportation infrastructure in place. They're walkable. You can densify neighborhoods that already exist. But again, many of them, as you can see on the map here, are along the shoreline. Next slide. Great. So this is just illustrating what I was speaking about earlier is the natural lands in the Bay Area. Our most vulnerable habitats are along our shoreline. And this is especially prevalent, as you can see on this map, in the North Bay. If you've ever driven along State Route 37, you've seen some of the fantastic habitats that we have here in the Bay. And you can see also here with the sea level rise flooding, all of that used to be Bay. All of it is going to be Bay someday, again, in the future, if we don't do something about it. So you can go to the next slide. And a lot of these overlap. So part of the study that we did was looking at where you have co-location of vulnerable transportation networks, vulnerable communities, socioeconomically vulnerable communities, future growth areas, and these habitat areas. And these are the areas where they overlap and they're all going to be flooded at the same time. We call these hotspots. So you can see here, they really are everywhere in the Bay Area. There's really no portion of our Bay shoreline that's not going to be impacted. It's just a matter of what's going to be impacted first and what type of asset is there. The things we didn't look at in the study that are also really important are things like wastewater treatment plants that are always located along the shoreline because they rely on the access to water and the gravity. And my executive director's favorite line is that even if you are not flooding yourself, the day you cannot flush your toilet, you will notice the impacts of sea level rise. So I wanted to also just mention here, we've done another study on what adaptation is needed around the Bay, where we already have projects that are in the planning stage or under construction or development, and where we still need to do planning and what it's going to cost us. So this map here shows study areas that are already underway. The dark blue and it is projects that are already begun. The light blue is study areas where we know people are looking at solutions, but maybe haven't started construction yet. And then all of the green is the areas where we know it's going to be flooded. We know it's vulnerable, but we haven't planned a project there yet. And the estimated total for protection of all vulnerable portions of the shoreline before 2050 is $110 billion. So there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done into the future. But at the same time, our study showed that if we don't do this work, we're going to lose at least $230 billion in assets that are lost. And then I think I'm into my slideshow.
Great.
So that's just a drive-by overview of all the things that we're going to be facing. And of course, it plays out differently in every community. So we can get into that maybe later.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. This might be an opportunity for me to jump in, and then we're going to go to Allison Chan to talk about resources. And then, you know, Stephen has a lot to say. We're sitting on his big project he's working on. But BARC, just to give a quick overview and build from what Dana shared there, I work a lot with Dana. BARC is a consortium, as Rebecca said, of state and regional agencies. That includes BCDC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the Association of Area Governments, the Air Quality Management District. And then we have 3 other members that have joined who are integral parts of this work we're doing together on flooding and sea level rise, including the State Coastal Conservancy, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and Caltrans District 4, which, as Dana mentioned, we have a lot of really vulnerable transportation infrastructure around the shoreline, as you all experience and know probably. So, you know, MTC and BCDC worked on this great report that I think highlighted just getting our arms around what is it going to take to prepare our communities, do the kinds of interventions necessary to prepare our communities for the threat we know is coming. We just don't know exactly when and exactly how bad, but we are getting a pretty good sense of what we can anticipate. And out of that, we're like, we need $110 billion. How are we going to organize ourselves to go after those kinds of resources, especially knowing that we are competing against other regions around the country that are responding to actual disasters, hurricanes. I mean, look at what's happening in New Orleans again today. So we have to get our ducks in a row as a region to make the case for why we need the big federal and state level investments in preparing our community. So it's an interesting dynamic, even though we are already experiencing flooding in many of our communities. This idea of how we proactively get in front of this challenge and put resources towards something that isn't impacting us immediately and now is against human nature in many ways. So we are working together to try to figure out how to bring this resources to communities to help tackle that, which Stephen is doing right now. So we just recently signed, all 7 of those agencies I've outlined, signed a memorandum of understanding that basically builds out a work program for our respective agencies to take on different roles and responsibilities, some taking the lead on some aspects, like BCDC and much of the local planning that you'll be leading, which I'm going to remind you, have to talk about the release of your guidelines on Monday. So how do we organize ourselves? A big part of that is working together to go after funding. And that could include regional measures down the line, or working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is a really critical partner in all of this. That's where a lot of the federal funding is going to come from. Of course, FEMA and EPA. So we're right now, they've signed off on this MOU, and now we need to operationalize that. And it's not just our agencies. We recognize there are many stakeholders around the region that are at the table, and ultimately our role is to help local governments, special districts, those critical partners at the local level get the resources they need to implement the projects that are going to be different everywhere. Some are going to be nature-based, some are necessarily going to need to be more engineered, great infrastructure. And so how are we thinking about that in a coherent way is just part of the struggle. We have a lot of stakeholders and interest in this, like you all, that want to be part of the discussion and figuring that out. So that's underway, and that's encouraging. And so with that, Allison, maybe do you want to kind of provide an overview of what your interests are in the space and what you're working on in the space? I think a lot around, thank God for a Save the Bay who's out there helping to raise money and on measures and other climate legislation. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to be here today. And I think I'll step back and just talk about why Save the Bay, how Save the Bay thinks about climate adaptation. As I'm sure many of you are aware of, conversations around climate for a very long time have focused on mitigation. How do we emit less? How do we reduce energy consumption? And while those conversations are still critical and we need to continue having them, we also needed to accept that we will have to adapt to impacts that we can't prevent. And in this region, high on our minds are, wildfire and flooding. And, Dana touched a little bit on the fact that so much of what's at risk in the Bay Area with respect to sea level rise and flooding include communities that are, vulnerable and underserved in other ways. Because of that, Save the Bay sees investing in flood adaptation as a real equity imperative. It's a privilege to not have to worry about adapting to flooding and to only think about how we can, hack our lifestyles to ensure that we emit less carbon and use less energy. That's not a privilege that a lot of our population has, especially those who are living on formerly redlined, low-lying portions of the Bay shoreline that have already suffered from seasonal flooding just from regular storms, let alone the sea level rise that we know is coming and the more extreme storms that are frankly already here. So that's the perspective that Save the Bay is coming at flood adaptation with, that, equity is a centerpiece of why we're focusing on it. And as we engage in policy and funding solutions to address sea level rise and storm-based flooding, we're trying to ensure that those policies and that funding at minimum serves the most underserved communities in our region, and hopefully therefore helps everybody else. And so one of the major ways that Save the Bay is doing that is by trying to build political will. There are so many fantastic agencies and their staff that are working so hard to put together plans and do outreach. And at the end of the day, a lot of these decisions rest with our elected and appointed officials. And they can be a difficult ship to turn. So a lot of what we plan to focus on, what we've been focusing on and what we plan to focus on is building the knowledge base and understanding among our elected and appointed officials for the need for adaptation and what solutions are available to us. And therefore hopefully increase their motivation and commitment to seeking and securing funding and equipping their staff to go after that funding and organize us at a regional scale to utilize it. So we are going out there and having conversations with everyone from local elected officials up to members of Congress. We are, trying to utilize the media and social media to get the word out and show that this is something that electeds should care about, not just because Save the Bay cares about it and not just because regional agencies care about it, but because their constituents care about it. And that's the truth. And we're also trying to not just be the only nonprofit in the room. There are folks in these communities that are facing these real risks that have a lot of data and knowledge to offer to, the policy solutions we have to come up with. We should be relying on their knowledge. We should be thinking about data in different ways. And it doesn't always just mean data generated by an agency, but knowledge from impacted communities should be taken into account, but not just that, prioritized in the process of developing solutions. So I guess a couple of things, and I don't want to take up too much more time, but a couple of things I would highlight as priorities for you all to be paying attention to is in this upcoming election, Props 4 and 5. Prop 4 is the climate bond. We absolutely need this state level funding to advance all of the projects that we want to see happen. We are hoping that a lot of those projects focus on nature-based solutions. Absolutely, there are places where you can't utilize wetlands and dirt and plants to solve all the problems. I mean, the waterfront here is one example of that, but there are places where nature-based solutions are a fantastic idea. So we're hoping that voters will support Prop 4 on the ballot and start generating that adaptation money for our local, regional, and state agencies to utilize. There are $600 million of projects, mostly wetland restoration and other sort of nature-based adaptation projects, already identified in the Bay Area that could move forward if funding were to become available. And that's not to say that doesn't include all the projects that haven't been developed yet that are only at very infant stages of development. So a lot of work to be done. That money will be used. Another proposition, Prop 5, is way less sexy, but extremely important. It lowers the voter threshold for local bond measures to 55%. A lot of people don't care about local bond measures, but they're so important for getting the kind of adaptation work done that we're talking about today. And it's so difficult for local government to get those passed because they currently require a 2/3 vote. A lot of them are polling right around 55%. So if we could get that threshold lowered, then a lot more local funding could go toward these critical projects, and we wouldn't have to be as reliant on state and federal funding as we have been. We will still rely on it, but it will at least balance that capacity out. So I'll pause there and I have more to say.
Great, thanks. And we'll have time for questions from you all too after we make these initial presentations. So thanks, Allison. We've been kind of operating at a high level, the three of us, and now is an opportunity to hear from somebody who is deep in the trenches, if you will, on where we're sitting and planning around this work. So I wonder, Stephen, if you could just give us an overview of what's happening along the waterfront here and kind of the big questions that you're grappling with.
Yeah, happy to. Is there any chance we can get that presentation? Okay. Let's not start with this. Please. Speaking of local bond measures and that 2/3 threshold, we really got started here with the Waterfront Resilience Program at the Port of San Francisco. And then 2016 or so is when we were really kind of getting initial studies off the ground. And at that time, we were focused on seismic. Let's not forget we're in earthquake country here. And it's been a long time since we've had a big earthquake, 1989, Loma Prieta. It's a good shaker, but was down in Santa Cruz, 60 miles away. And the engineers would not consider that strong ground shaking up here. And so that threat of that next earthquake is a big one for us, and we'll test our waterfront in ways that it has not been tested before. And so we went to voters in 2018 for what's called seawall earthquake safety bond. And that passed with 83%, right? 83%. So, and San Franciscans love the waterfront, and it's obvious, and they want to protect it, and they're concerned about earthquake risk. But at the time, they also were voicing their concerns about sea level rise. And as we moved through our program, that's become a big thrust of our work. And so if you're looking at the map here, you're looking at future flood risk, which is essentially in San Francisco on the bay side, which is essentially the filled lands for the most part. And as I mentioned, the seismic risk is here and now. We can get that damaging earthquake at any time. And the waterfront was not built to modern seismic standards, and it was built on filled lands over top of bay mud, and so not a great place to be when an earthquake happens. Next slide. So when we looked at the sort of funding availability for a large infrastructure project on our waterfront, where San Francisco's got 7.5 miles of waterfront from Hyde Street Harbor down to Hunters Point area, not quite Hunters Point, but we looked at the federal government, state, local, private sources. We had a pie chart, and we said, I don't know, maybe this much from federal and this much from, and then what are those potential sources on the federal side? It's the Army Corps of Engineers currently that has the big dollars. So if you get a feasibility study with the Army Corps of Engineers, and they find that there's a federal interest for a flood risk management project, the federal government will pay 65%, and the local needs to come up with 35%. That's a pretty good deal. And is there a limit? No, there's no limit. I mean, there's a limit to what Congress will approve because Congress has to approve it. But okay, so we started working with the Army Corps of Engineers. We got a general investigation with them. Actually, the president at the time who had to sign off on that, his name was Trump. And he liked to build walls, and so maybe he saw this as a wall on San Francisco's waterfront, keep bad water out, and we started working with the Corps. And so the Corps is has a certain way they look at projects, which is really a national economic development benefit to cost analysis. How many dollars are expected to occur over the period of time from flooding? You build a project, what does that project cost? Is that less expensive or more expensive than the damages? And that's kind of how projects move forward. And they were not considering sea level rise necessarily either. It was not a big issue. So we were entered this, project study with the Army Corps of Engineers, saying, let's look at sea level rise and let's look at comprehensive benefits. What you see on the screen right now is, measures that we looked at in the study, structural stuff. You heard gray infrastructure. We're over water right now. Most of the waterfront in San Francisco is gray infrastructure, piers and wharves and seawalls and buildings that sit over top of it that are historic. Non-structural things, maybe we're living with water. Can you go back one slide? And I'll speed up. Non-structural things, maybe we're living with water. And then it's okay.
Back.
I was gonna say back. Yeah, there we go. Non-structural, maybe we're living with water. We're flood-proofing structures and infrastructure. Maybe we're retreating in some areas. That requires buyouts, and then looking at nature-based solutions. We do have some areas along the port's waterfronts that are natural, where nature-based solutions can work. We also think that there are areas, even in the northern waterfront, where nature-based solutions can be quite appropriate. And so looking at all those measures in the study, next slide. Think about them in a comprehensive benefit way, not just national economic development, but other social effects, social connectedness, the local economy, health and safety, thinking about seismic safety, disaster response capability, historic and cultural assets here in the very building here, built in 1898, over water, and then our socially vulnerable communities. So putting all that into the mix of how you value a project. Next slide. And the Army Corps is very accepting of that. They are actually, as an organization, looking at making a transition to more comprehensive benefits. And so this study is one that, the Corps is watching, right? The Corps is watching from a leadership perspective, which is very exciting for us. And so the other piece of this study with sea level rise is sea level rise continues to increase, projections that I've seen, and even accelerates in the future. And so, this concept of adaptation, the Army Corps is used to building something, lasts for 50 to 75 or 100 years. And here, maybe that's not the approach you would take, right? Maybe you would build some things and then adapt it over time. And so in this study, it looks at a period of 100 years, and it looks at adapting things over time and thresholds and monitoring that would trigger those next subsequent actions. Next slide. We're at a draft plan stage. Where we are on the waterfront right here actually includes raising this whole area, including this building. How high? Good question. If you're going in there to raise it, it probably should be pretty high, because think about adaptation. You're not necessarily going to want to come back and do that again anytime soon. And so they have decided in this area, where there's a lot of hard infrastructure, a lot of buildings and things that need to get brought up, that the first action would just jump to a very big move that would last a long time. And so it's thinking of that this is raising anywhere from 5 to 6 to 7 feet. And as design advances and sea level rise projections get hopefully a little more certainty, and the band of uncertainty starts to come down a little bit, we can think about that elevation a little bit better and get a little bit better. Next slide. In Fisherman's Wharf, plan is actually floodproofing. So it's more of living with water, floodproof these facilities. When you're down there, you can see that you quickly start to go up in the city, and so there's not as much damage inland. We're really just talking about the area right around Fisherman's Wharf. And so this first action is floodproofing. Next slide. Go ahead, next slide. In this sort of core area of the historic waterfront, as I mentioned, it's building up. It's replacing the seawall, replacing wharves, with buildings being raised on top of them, and regrading and redoing the Embarcadero roadway. Building in seismic protection, seismic stability, and looking at the transit corridor in a way that is more comprehensive for all users. And that's a big undertaking. Okay. Next slide. This just shows for the historic piers. So we're talking about raising the bulkhead zone, which is generally the first 50 feet or so. These piers stick out in the water up to 800 feet. Those are not in the plan. Those are not going to be protected, raised in the plan. Those are outside the city line of defense. And the strategy out there is essentially flood proofing, putting some flood walls around the piers to try to get a little bit more life out of them. But at some point, they need to be demolished or replaced or raised. And that's a decision that we have to grapple with as local community as a board as to how we value those structures. And we, of course, San Francisco point to private equity for those investments. Next. As we get further down Shoreline into South Beach and Mission Bay, there's more adaptation space down there. And so the first action is a little bit smaller and consists more of flood walls and berms for the most part. Again, though, with seismically stable foundations so that they can be adapted onto. Next slide. We spoke a lot about the bridges that cross the creeks, like Lefty O'Doul by the ballpark. And where the Corps landed was, we'll leave the bridges as is, and we'll put closure structures there. SFMTA doesn't like that. So SFMTA is, commented on that, is thinking about, the trend, maybe that's not adequate for the transit network to have those kind of disruptions. And at first, when this is very infrequent, maybe that's fine, but as sea level rise is going up and these closures need to go into place more frequently, maybe that's not so good. And so a raising of the bridges is going to be looked at. Next. And then as we get down into the Business Creek Bayview area, again, more adaptation space, port cargo terminals out there. And so really these are shorter flood walls and berms and levees in the first action. Next slide. And I will say that all this has a price tag that's been estimated, and that first action has been estimated at $13.5 billion.
What a bargain.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thanks. Well, I think Stephen kind of illustrated how one project involves so many projects, right? And that need to be phased in over time. But one question that comes up to me, and it came up for John too, and Allison, you alluded to it, is, here we're in a fairly well-resourced community that was able to go to the voters and raise, that's $8 billion bond, 425 million.
425
million. So a good way to get you going.
Started.
But there are a lot of other communities around the shoreline that are, we'll say the haves and the have-nots that really haven't even had the capacity to really start thinking about this. And Dana, you talked about that too, but I wonder if maybe you guys could jump in, and this is your opportunity to talk about the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan too, which is being released, the draft being released on Monday, but maybe talk about what are the strategies we can take as a region to make sure that everybody, I always use the term, we're only as strong as our weakest link, really, in this Bay Area. We're all connected in so many ways. So thoughts that you have about how we can level the playing field for all the communities that are going to experience flooding in the Bay Area. I don't know who wants to jump in there.
I'll just start. I'll take the bait that you just gave me, Allison. So the short answer is it's now required by law. So last year, SB 272 passed, and that states that every shoreline community in the state of California now needs to do a sea level rise adaptation plan. On the outer coast, it's the Coastal Commission, but here in the Bay, it's my agency that is charged with setting the standards of what those adaptation plans should look like. And that will lead to consistency in the adaptation plans that's being done around the Bay, and will also hopefully, spur the communities that haven't done planning yet to do it. This is a law that has really no consequences if you don't comply with it. But we've put a lot of effort into making sure that cities and counties understand why it's important to do it in a way that is consistent around the region. I've had all those slides that show the Bay as a whole and all of the systems that connect us all. And the main thing that connects us all is the Bay. I mean, if something happens in one portion of the shoreline and somebody does the most fantastic, seawall adaptation planning, whatever, and their neighbor doesn't, the water doesn't care. The water's going to go around the wall and flood the neighbor. So it's important for us to do it consistently around the region. It's important for everyone to do it. And what Allison was alluding to is BCDC, we've developed a draft of the guidelines that will tell local cities and counties how to do these plans. We were required by this legislation to complete them by December of this year. So, just my staff has not gotten a lot of sleep in the past year, but we're releasing the public comment draft on Monday. So it'll be open for everyone to look at, to see the sort of policy implications that we're asking people to consider as they do adaptation planning. Just the sheer level of effort it will take to do these plans. Like I'm not going to pretend like this isn't a big lift for the Bay Area, but obviously the Senator Laird, who sponsored the bill, thinks it's important. We think it's important, and over time, it's what we're all going to be doing. And just as kind of a highlight, some of the things that we're asking people to look at is to make sure that they're centering equity in their adaptation approaches, both in their process, including communities in decision making, and also in outcomes. So making sure that we're getting resources to under-resourced communities first, that we're making sure that we're protecting them and not just letting them flood. So that's a big underpinning. Looking at nature-based solutions first is also a big underpinning. If the wetlands are the things we're going to lose first, so we need to address them first. We're also looking at asking people to look at changes over time. So you can build a seawall tomorrow. I just use seawall as an example. I don't advocate for that for lots of portions of the shoreline. But you can build something tomorrow and it may stop being protective 50 to 100 years down the line. So we're asking people to start thinking about the implications of things like that. It's also going to set standards for the flood hazards that people look at and the sea level rise scenarios. So everyone's planning for the same water levels at the same time so that there's consistency across the region. So if anyone in this room can comment, can read it, it's only 200 pages. No big deal. The public comment period will be open for 5 weeks, and we will actually have a public hearing at BCDC at one of our commission meetings, October 17th. So if you're interested in taking a look at that, you can go to the BCDC website or bayadapt.org.
Thank you. Good job. Allison, yeah, jump in.
Yeah, a couple things that I thought of while Dana was talking. Regarding the requirement now that our cities all do this local planning, I'm so glad that there will be, one set of consistent guidance for the region. So Dana, you and your sleeplessness, it's going to be worth it. But the challenge of that legislation, although it is hopefully going to be transformative, is that it gives cities 10 years to comply. And, that may not feel that long, except that planning is one thing and executing projects is another. And, when you hear timelines like we started planning in 2016, big transformative projects take a long time. So we don't want cities to sit on this requirement. The guidance will be out in a couple months, and we want our cities to act on that as soon as possible. So that's going to be one of the focuses for us and for a lot of other nonprofits in the region, is to encourage cities to take action soon, begin the planning process, make sure it takes into account community feedback, and don't wait until year 9 before planning for the big projects and policies that are going to be needed. The other thing I was going to say is to maybe take a step back on the concept of nature-based solutions, because I think for this group, most of us up here, we talk about it all the time, and it's sort of an assumption that, hey, yeah, we're all behind this, but it may not be clear to all of you what we're talking about. And so I will take a stab at that. What we're talking about are solutions to protecting people, infrastructure, and habitat from the impacts of flooding and sea level rise that utilize literally dirt and plants to provide that protection. You've maybe heard before that wetlands offer a natural buffer from storm surges and from flooding. It's a sponge, it slows down storm surges. And if you incorporate, for example, wetland restoration with a levee that has vegetation on it, it provides a multitude of benefits beyond flood control. And that's what will sell these kinds of solutions. Yes, we can rely on concrete and steel, but they're mostly one-trick ponies, and there is a question about how long they'll last. If you find candidate locations for nature-based solutions where that kind of a solution is appropriate, it can provide that flood protection. It provides recreational space. It enhances habitat. It replaces habitat where habitat has been destroyed. It provides so many benefits to the region that a typical or traditional engineered solution might not. The challenge is that it costs more. But if we were to become a little bit more expansive in our thinking about a cost-benefit analysis around nature-based solutions, it would be very clear to decision makers that the investment is worth it. And so the challenge is acquiring that funding and building the political will to invest. So Save the Bay has several active restoration sites around the bay in which we are, actively restoring wetlands where wetlands have been lost. And we're working on these sort of hybrid solutions that are an engineered levee, but have the vegetation on it, wetland vegetation on it. You'll also hear that referred to as a horizontal levee. And in fact, some of those projects could also provide additional treatment for sewage treatment plants. So one example of that is at the Oro Loma Sanitary District in Union City. That pilot project isn't actually connected to the bay, but it was the proof of concept that you could build a levee, vegetate it, enjoy all the flood protection benefits. And by the way, if you send partially treated wastewater through it that still has a lot of nutrients, which are really damaging to the bay environment, all those dirt and plants clean it out really, really effectively. So now there's going to be another project in Palo Alto that will be connected to the bay, and that water will get released into the bay. So I just have to sing the praises of nature-based solutions because I think it's worth the investment, and we're hoping to convince our decision makers of the same thing.
And it doesn't necessarily just have to be on the shoreline either. I mean, this whole notion of making our communities more like a sponge to absorb water, because we know we're going to get these periods of extreme storms, and then we'll maybe have periods of drought as well. But ideas like stormwater management, where we're creating a lot more opportunity to green our communities, which makes the quality of life so much better. It beautifies our communities, but then brings all this idea of multi-benefit strategies, which nature can really provide for many of our communities. So if any of you have questions, start getting ready. I think our goal was we were going to end around 3:30 so everyone can enjoy some of this spread over there. But yeah, does anyone have a question? All right.
Hold on. Okay. So one question.
Oh, thank you, BJ.
And
Here, you want to just hand them?
yeah, perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
great. See. Oh, well, maybe, I'm not sure are there any plans for the Ocean Beach area? Is anyone familiar with the Ocean Beach? You want to talk about that? No, I mean, there's been a lot of work. There has been a lot of work on Ocean Beach.
There isn't, I'm not, I haven't been working on that project specifically, and BCDC works on the bay side and not the outer coast, but I do know that Spur has worked quite extensively on Ocean Beach, and they've published actually many reports on their work out there. So I don't know if anyone else has any additional knowledge on that, but right, I know there's stuff out there. It's just our panelists.
I'm going to put an audience member on the spot. Laura Walsh is one of Save the Bay's brand new policy managers and came from the Surfrider Foundation and has deep knowledge of what's going on in Ocean Beach. Do you want to say one or two sentences about it?
Yeah, sure.
You're welcome to come up and use the
Yeah,
microphone.
Wow.
All right. to tap in?
I might pay for this later.
Oh,
I thought you thought I asked the question.
So I'm coming at this from an advocacy perspective, so I don't work for Spur or anything, but from kind of tracking what they've been doing, there was a master plan process that started in 2010 to build resilience in Ocean Beach, because especially in the south end of the beach, that's like one of the resilience hotspots in California for erosion, basically. It's eroding really quickly because of the way that, sand moves from the bay. It's also a really popular surf spot, and there's a ton of wastewater infrastructure and other, there's a road, there's all that infrastructure there. So there's a really high profile adaptation project happening at the end of the beach, and that's called the South Ocean Beach Climate Adaptation Project. So they currently are going to the Coastal Commission, which is the Pacific Coast, sister of BCDC, to try to get a permit to essentially build a seawall that they want to bury. So they want to keep it covered in sand, but it is sort of like a large traditional seawall. And then the rest of the beach, there's dune restoration efforts planned and sort of like sand replenishment efforts planned. And it's a great thing for people to advocate on how nature-based solutions could fit in there.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I have a couple questions, I think, around timeline. I think people have questions around if we don't get the 150, 110 billion we need, what starts to happen in the next 30 years? What communities are impacted first? How are we going to, what starts to happen in terms of our adaptation response? I'm looking at you because I think that's a good, and I'm sure you guys are thinking about this too.
Yeah, so so I saw, before we began the panel, I saw some slides cycling through, and one of them was a screenshot of our Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer. And that's an online mapping tool that anyone can look at, and look at what different flood levels are going to do to the shoreline. And you can type in your address and you can look at your house. Don't do that if you have a low tolerance for risk. But that's something that anyone can look at and understand the risk at any portion of the shoreline. In terms of time horizons, for the Shoreline Adaptation Plan guidelines, our 2050 2050 sea level rise projection is about a foot. And we just worked with the Ocean Protection Council, who updated their sea level rise projections this year, and we're aligned with all the projections for the rest of the state. And I think as Stephen said, the closer it is in time, the more certainty we have. The farther out the time, the wider the band of what we might see. And a lot of this depends on a lot of our actions today and how much we're able to manage our greenhouse gas emissions. So we look at 3 time horizons, 2050, 2100, and 2150. And at the 2100 time line, we're looking at, we could possibly see anything from 3 to 3.3 feet to 6.6 feet. The 6.6 feet might not happen until 2100. Again, the farther out you get, the less certainty you have. But that's kind of the sort of slow moving trajectory that we're looking at. But it is possible too that as time goes by, the rate of sea level rise will accelerate. We actually have already seen sea level rise as measured at the tidal gate at the Golden Gate Bridge, starting in when they started measuring it. I think it was around 1900 or so. We've seen about 8 to 10 inches since then, and so it's kind of slowly increasing, and then it will accelerate as we go along. So if we don't, the first impact we're going to see if we aren't able to do the protection we need is we're going to lose our wetlands. Secondly, all the places that are flooding now in major storms are going to stay underwater permanently. So we're going to start seeing impacts slowly, but they're going to accelerate over time.
I should mention, and I think this answers part of somebody's question. One of the other avenues we're pursuing of the regional agencies and other partners is additional work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers around what's called a comprehensive study. So, and we're focused on it's a different model. There's a feasibility study. A comprehensive study looks at multiple sites around the shoreline, and what this process allows us to do is the Army Corps will do that technical analysis. We've identified mostly our disadvantaged communities along the shoreline to benefit from this program, where the Army Corps would go and do the technical analysis for those communities, those that many just are, and this would, the Coastal Conservancy and our partnership would do the heavy lifting involved in working with the Army Corps on those communities' behalf to get the Army Corps and work with them. And out of that, and this is examples from Mississippi and other places across the country where they've effectively been able to raise about $50 billion through this type of approach, this comprehensive study. It opens up the opportunity for other federal resources to fund the projects that are identified. And it's, we're excited. We recognize working with the Army Corps is challenging, but it's really kind of our best way to make sure that all of our communities have the resources and technical expertise they need to get to the project level. So I think that gets to, will regional funds be made available to those who can't afford it? That is a real focus of ours, to make sure we can get resources to the communities that don't have them now. And I know a lot of the work that BCDC is doing is identifying those communities and we're trying to develop a technical program that would give them resources and capacity. But I also heard people want to hear, what about Treasure Island? We're here with the Treasure Island Museum. And John did prepare a question around the Treasure Island. So its sustainability plan essentially remade the island, bringing in dirt and pounding it down and raising it by several feet. And in some ways, this is almost starting from scratch. I don't know if you can, easier than working in. So it's starting from scratch, which they're a little bit able to do over at Treasure Island, easier than trying to re-engineer or kind of go into existing shoreline communities to address the threat of flooding and sea level rise. If it would like to step into, maybe you do, Stephen, with the 1898 building we're sitting in.
Yeah, we're sitting over water, and it's a whole lot easier if this building burned not here. Over water, right? Our biggest challenge is that, where we need to build a new line of defense, there's all this existing stuff. City infrastructure, transit infrastructure, combined sewer system infrastructure, historic, culturally significant buildings. And so one of the things that when we first started thinking about this project, and me being an engineer, how's it going to be easier to do this? I would do it somewhere else. And so I said, why don't we just start build a new seawall further bayward? And obviously, the saving the bay meant we should stop thinking about filling the bay. But as we start to think about, sea level rise, perhaps there are some spots where there's beneficial use to some amount of fill when you can make critical infrastructure decisions a little bit easier to do the adaptation. Something to think about, because it is a lot easier to do this type of construction when there's not other stuff in.
So,
Yeah.
So in a sense, you're saying that one of the, I think what you're saying, I'm sorry. One of the things that might be suggested is that there are important lessons to be learned from Treasure Island, that even though it's not necessarily possible and we've taken filling in the bay, that it is easier to start from scratch or build where there isn't a lot of infrastructure. And so they had that fortune.
Well, my mic is gonna drop to the floor. I don't know. Hold it. So when cities begin working on these adaptation plans that BCDC is going to require, one example of a local policy we're hoping cities adopt are to re-examine their zoning ordinances. In other words, what do you build and where? And also, how do you build? So there are precedents out there of policies that require buildings to be built up from the beginning to a certain level so that if flooding occurs, the building is not impacted. And one of the things that we really advocate for, and this isn't going to solve the whole problem, but it can solve part of it, is for any new development coming from here on out, let's focus it away from the areas that we saw on the map. Let's not emphasize building new development in places that are at risk. It won't be entirely avoidable. We wouldn't want to completely cut off communities from new development, but where possible, let's concentrate commercial development and housing near transit centers. Most of our transit corridors, major transit centers and corridors, are not in super high risk flood areas, and there are so many other benefits to focusing development in transit corridors. People who live near transit tend to use it, and especially if we're building affordable housing near transit, they're definitely going to use it. The data is there. So I think there are things that our municipalities have control over in terms of planning into the future, planning development into the future, that can help avoid the difficult decision that we find ourselves in with existing development, like focusing development away from flood zones. So that's one of the approaches that we're encouraging the cities to take.
Nice, I just add, on top of that. So, one of the ways that we're addressing this in the guidelines for the plans is, yes, not placing new development, in areas of high risk, but for many locations along the shoreline, people are already living there and, they want their homes protected. So we're recommending that people consider protection of existing development, as long as the useful life of that development is still there. Or until it no longer becomes financially feasible. At some point, if you have to continue to build up your protection and continue to add, dollars over many decades to protect a certain area, there comes a tipping point where it's probably not worth it anymore, either to the private landowners or to the government. So that's our recommendation for considering what you do with your existing development and how long you protect it for, and sort of what your options are down the line. And in some cases, it actually does make sense. Yes, many of our transit areas are not right on the shoreline, but many of them are. Ferry terminals are along the shoreline. There are sometimes very desirable reasons to double down on development in areas that are walkable, that have infrastructure in place, that have, neighborhood stores and nice places to live that are along the shoreline. And in those locations, we are encouraging people to think about protecting those locations rather than, starting over. So I think it really varies. There's a whole spectrum of development along the shoreline, ranging from really dense, and we definitely need to protect this, to, there's a wetland here and we shouldn't build on this for like 800 different reasons. And so there's a different policy approach for sort of every step along that spectrum.
I would just add too that it's different to be living behind a levee that might get flooded once every 10 or 20 years. Which is, as sea level's going up, it's like, oh, well, it's a 100-year storm. And it's a 10-year storm, then it's high tides every day. And so if you're living behind a levee where, a high tide every day would flood where you are, like the reliability of that levee has to be some, it's a little bit different. And we're an earthquake country too. And so, that's kind of a threshold to really need to think about.
We have one example that was really encouraging, because I know people are looking to hear, like, what are examples of great projects underway, not just planning, but great projects around the bay that we could point to. But one that's not here, but it's on the East Coast, and a community that was impacted by Superstorm Sandy or Hurricane Sandy was Hoboken, New York. And they were one of the most heavily hit by that storm, and made a lot of investments out of the rebuild by design process, where they focused a lot of investments along the shoreline around cisterns and places for water to go in times of extreme storms. Like there's a new park they create along the shoreline, and underneath it is an area that can store water underneath the park. And they did a lot of other things as well. So more recently, there was a big storm, well, it was a regular storm, but it ended up flooding parts of New York City. And Hoboken was not impacted at all because they figured out ways in which to manage water, which is really what we're talking about in a lot of ways. Is water is going to be coming, water is going to be coming from a lot of different places, and how are we going to manage it as long as we can manage it in a way to protect our communities. Of course, there are places like Pacifica with houses built along the shoreline that are, not able to do that. But those are more rare circumstances, I think, than, where retreat has to enter the picture. But can any of you give some examples? You talked about the North Richmond horizontal levee, or examples of other projects we could point to that are bright lights in the regions? I don't know if you want to jump in.
I'll just say that a lot of what we're focusing on now is wetlands restoration, and we do have a regional measure in place, Measure AA, that it adds a fee to everybody's property tax that pays for wetlands restoration. And to me, that's the first line of projects that we need to be focusing on. The South Bay Salt Ponds project is the most extensive, wetlands restoration project that I'm aware of. There's a lot of levees being breached in the North Bay and breaching the levees means that it's reconnecting those areas that have been hydrologically disconnected back to the bay so that they can naturally become wetlands again. And you can do things to accelerate that, like adding sediment and adding the dirt in the plants, as Allison talks about. So I will just say that, from the phase one, sea level rise adaptation, our wetlands restoration projects that are occurring around the bay, I think, are what I would elevate at this point.
We have one more incoming, and then we're gonna, do you wanna, you can, we're gonna have to close out. This is the private equity, the private investment, I think, is one thing we haven't talked about yet, but I've been stunned by the spectacular public and private investment in Mission Bay development. How has this been allowed to proceed, and can further development there be slowed or stopped? That, I think, is part of how long planning processes take and how long it takes to actually get the development underway. Is that part of the, are you gonna stop it, Stephen?
No, I mean, I can speak about Mission Rock development, which is the section out there across from the ballpark where there are a few new buildings and a great new park that opened up recently, which that's on the Port of San Francisco's property. And that proceeded a little bit differently than the greater Mission Bay development area. First of all, came later and fully aware that sea level rise was a real thing to deal with. And this is a brand new site. And so we went to our developers and we said, you need to go up quite a bit higher. We're going to give you the most conservative projection, which at the time was 55 inches by 2100. You got to be up above that. And they said, okay. And so they built the whole site up. And they also said, I'm on Bay Mud here and I'm looking at Mission Bay area where stuff is settling. And I don't want to settle. And so that facility is on improved ground and lightweight fill. And it's not we're not expecting any settlement from that facility. And the development, the value that it's generating is paying for shoreline protection and park.
Hand it over to close this out.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're running out of time and we're gonna have to close now, but rest assured that this conversation will go on for years. It's not going to end. I want to thank our panelists so much for lending us their time and their expertise. And I mean, clearly it's complex and it's overwhelming, and each of us needs to sort of bite off what we can and do what we can. I want to say that I just want to invite you to enjoy some treats over there. And then some of us are going to go, we take the ferry from here, from the ferry building to go over to Treasure Island, see the gallery, the Treasure Island Museum Gallery, maybe have a drink at Gold Bar. I think we've got a printout of the ferry schedule. So that's really fun on a beautiful day like this. Others of us will go to GOTS downstairs so we can continue this conversation. Okay, so thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, people.
Audience,
I'm very heard.
are there questions from the Zoom audience?
I don't know. We're checking now. Good point.
Yeah, there's just, we will be sending the Zoom audience the links to, the art program that BCDC mentioned, et cetera. I don't see questions here. Greg Brecken has a question or comment. He says the Chronicle in 2006 published a map on its front page showing what areas of the city will flood with sea level rise. Much of the flood zone was in South of Market, where high-rise development has been densest and highest since then. The same is happening in cities around the world. In London, for example, high-rises are being built outside of the Thames barrier, which itself was not designed for projected sea level rise. More of a comment, but it's interesting to hear from some of our esteemed distant Zoom participants, and I thank them all for their patience. Another comment was Scott Wiener's legislation to override local zoning ordinances and environmental restrictions will ensure that even more housing will be built in known hazard zones. So these are concerns being voiced. And that is all. And I thank our Zoom participants, and we will be sending you all the links that people mentioned in email following the presentation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Can you give us a hand for the panelists? Thanks for coming.